Okay, so this is a continuation of what we talked about last Wednesday during the Zoom conference or Zoom meeting for remote learning. So we're going to finish off here with imperialism. Uh, if you remember, we talked about the steps to becoming an empire and how the Americans did it anyway, and the resulting acquisition from the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish American War, gave us this mighty empire of Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. And not to sell short these three areas, they were vital to our imperialistic ambitions. These are not exactly the same as the French or the English or the Germans and their imperial ambitions, specifically in Africa, but there were still some commonalities where we did exploit the people, we did exploit the resources, and we certainly utilized humanitarian aid as our justification, or even the Christianization, if that's a word. The spread of the Christian values and the Christian morals. We even use the idea that we're spreading democracy, we're spreading governmental ambition, if you will, to these people. And when you read The Imperial Cruise, which is about our takeover of the Philippines, chapter 4, which was just assigned to you today, you'll kind of understand a little bit more about the justifications that were used by our politicians, by our presidents, and of course, the impact that that would have on the people moving forward. But that's not the only places, these are not the only places that we took. We also took places like Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is under the command of a sovereign um, government and more importantly, a royal family headed by Queen Luakalani. Luakalani had basically been running the nation. She was widely considered to be the government of the Hawaiian Islands, and she was a Hawaiian nationalist. She was trying to unify the people under the banner of the Hawaiian. Uh, you know, race, if you will, the nation, if you will. At the same time, there is a fruit producer named Dole, and Sanford B. Dole is actually the brother of the fruit producer. So if you're thinking, oh, Dole pineapple, Dole banana, it's the same family. But Sanford B. Dole basically puts himself in a situation where he kind of tries to advise Queen Luakalani and the government of Hawaii, tries to get into the inner circle and basically tells her, hey, if you listen to me, I will help you to uh, navigate the problems that many of these American businessmen were getting involved, because they were creating, for lack of better terminology, a banana republic within Hawaii. And Luakalani was trying to resist that. Dole was trying to find the happy medium. Now, he's not a good guy. I make it seem like, oh, he's trying to do the best for Hawaii. He's not. He's interested in himself. He's interested in the United States fruit producers getting the betterment of this, getting the businessmen getting the better of it. And not surprisingly, they managed to overthrow Queen Luakalani. She eventually gets removed, put into exile. She spends out the rest of her days in Paris, which, when in doubt, the exile location of choice is always Paris. So if anybody ever says, "Hey, where did so and so get exiled?" unless they're a French person like Napoleon, the answer is usually Paris. Needless to say, Dole takes over, became the president of the Republic of Hawaii, and then guides Hawaii into the United States when they are annexed in 1898 under McKinley. This all started under Grover Cleveland, but its continuation, usually McKinley gets the credit in the history books because that's when they were added on to the United States. And 50 years later, they are going to be placed into the United States. They are going, well, 60 years later, they're going to be officially one of the United States of America. They're going to become the 50th state. Needless to say, we also are getting involved in Asia after the assassination of William McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt comes into the presidency. And again, he's the youngest president ever to take over. He's 42 years of age when he comes into office. He is somebody that believes in the strenuous life. He's somebody that believes in, getting out there and pursuing things and getting things done. He's a very active guy and widely considered to be the first quote unquote modern day president. Not surprisingly, he's the first president that really starts to look outside the borders of the United States. McKinley does to a certain degree, and I always think he gets sold short by history books when it comes to imperial ambition and the impact that he would have on the United States. But he unfortunately doesn't quite get to finish out his term because of an assassination. Teddy Roosevelt tends to get the moniker of the first modern president because he's not only progressive, which we'll get to this week, but he's also very imperialistic in his own mindset, but he's also somewhat diplomatic. He is a big believer in making the United States a force in global politics and diplomacy. And so it's not surprising that he leads the charge along with uh, his Secretary of State and most of his cabinet to try and open up China. He pairs up with the British and the French and the Germans and everybody else trying to get a foothold into China for trade purposes, which is where the open door policy comes in. And it basically says that they are not going to treat China the same way that they treated Africa. Basically, this is Teddy Roosevelt's version of trying to be magnanimous while still getting what he wants. Which is very much what Teddy Roosevelt is all about. The open door policy is the idea that instead of carving it up and dividing up the territory amongst the imperial powers, their goal is to get the resources. So they're going to share access. They're going to share ports of entry. They're going to share transportation hubs. This is what eventually leads to the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s, when the Chinese basically resist this outside influence and start fighting back. So for those of you wondering why China really has a closed door policy, to the West, they really kind of resist American influence. They resist European influence. It's because of this time period where our influence was definitely front and center in China. Of course, the Philippines, when the Spanish leave and America takes over, it's not easy. And we're going to talk a lot more about this with the Imperial Cruise reading that will kind of give you a much better window into what's happening in the Philippines realistically on the ground comparative to what I could say here. So after you do the reading, we'll definitely debrief on that. And of course, it's our involvement in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 places us in a situation where we become a world player because our president mediates a dispute between Russia and Japan, where if you think about it, looking at Russia and looking at Japan, you would think that Russia would be winning that conflict. In reality, Japan, because of their industrial capacity and because of their solid governmental supply lines and military tactics, they were beating the holy heck out of the Russians over in China. They were basically fighting over what is today Manchuria, and the Japanese were absolutely giving it to the Russians. Uh, Teddy Roosevelt manages to mediate that. He uses diplomacy, but he also uses some force. He kind of threatens the Japanese, and this is really what drives a wedge between the United States and the Japanese when it comes to foreign policy. And it kind of foreshadows the fact that they are going to bomb us in 1941 at Pearl Harbor. I know it's a huge leap from 1905 to 1941, but this is kind of the first salvo in a growing dispute between the two nations. Now, why is this such a momentous thing? Teddy Roosevelt, for his mediation, becomes the first United States president to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. He does that because of his mediation skills here. And in resolving the conflict. So he always kind of gets that as being, kind of a little feather in his cap that he was the first one to ever do it. But it does, weirdly enough, kind of lay the groundwork for an eventual conflict between us and the Japanese. When it comes to showing off our muscle when it came to expansion, and certainly our intentions when it came to imperial power, the Panama Canal kind of became a symbol of true American imperialism. And this is kind of how it went down. We basically wanted to build a canal for the longest time. If you remember Cornelius Vanderbilt, he wanted to build a canal that would help his steamship empire grow and prosper and link the east to the west through uh, sailing through the Gulf of Mexico and into the Pacific Ocean by creating a canal that went through Central America in some capacity. Their first route and their first belief was that they could go through Nicaragua, and they tried multiple times. but it just was not possible. It was way too complex. So instead, they turned their attention to Panama. Well, the problem is Panama at that time is owned by Colombia. Colombia had basically taken that province when they got their independence from Spain. So what ends up happening here is the Americans see an opportunity to build a canal in Panama. Colombia wants nothing to do with that. They don't want American influence. So instead of trying to negotiate with the Colombians, the Americans instead help, quote unquote, the Panamanian independence movement. They basically supply all kinds of weapons. We use military support, and we kind of twist the arm of the Colombians to grant the Panamanians their independence. After they get their independence, we support their new government with loans and all kinds of military support to solidify their control over their nation. Then we quote unquote borrow land to build the canal. We basically take the Isthmus of Panama, the 40 miles of land there, and we dig the canal. And we build the modern marvel, and then we make money off of the toll that these ships have to pay in order to use this canal to get from the Gulf of Mexico through to the Pacific Ocean. This becomes a military an important military installation. This becomes absolutely vital to Atlantic and Pacific trade. It completely eliminates the need to go all the way around South America, which of course affects South American nations' economies as well, because their port cities are definitely going to be hurt by this. There's all manner of things that are going to be implicated by the completion of this canal, but the person that gets to stamp their name on this is Teddy Roosevelt. So, not surprisingly, again, a modern president really showing that he's getting stuff done. Now, he's not the only one of these presidents. The imperial presidents happen to be the exact same as the progressive presidents. There will be an assignment coming up basically around these different presidents and their impact. You have Roosevelt and his Roosevelt corollary. The corollary, if you remember from math class, there are theories and corollaries. Corollaries are kind of an addition, an addendum to an already proposed theory or law of mathematics. Well, a corollary here means the exact same thing. There is a governmental, you know, a governmental treaty or a governmental dictate or whatever that then has an add-on. In this case, it's an add-on to the Monroe Doctrine, an amendment to the Monroe Doctrine, which is better known as big stick diplomacy. This is Teddy Roosevelt in his finest. His famous phrase was "speak softly and carry a big stick." The idea that you speak softly when somebody leans in to hear, you whack them with the stick. Like that type of mentality that you're going to kind of bully your way through your diplomacy. Well, in his mind, Monroe's doctrine that said that basically European nations have to leave our Western Hemisphere alone, and that the Western Hemisphere technically is America's playground, and don't you dare come over and start anything. This basically said that not only were we going to get involved if European nations came over and messed over here, it also said the US could intervene in Latin America if our economic interests were in jeopardy. So it's no longer a military thing. It's also that if our economic interests are threatened by either European intervention or any sort of Latin American trouble. So even if there's an independence movement, we can get involved. And we are going to use that to justify our involvement in Cuba. We're going to get involved in Cuba left and right because we have economic interests there, namely sugar. Sugar is a huge, huge crop, an agricultural boom to the United States. We have sugar producers down in Cuba who are basically monopolizing the market, turning it into a banana republic. And that is what eventually is going to drive a wedge between the United States and Cuba. When Fidel Castro takes over Cuba in the 1950s, he is going to basically have he's going to basically turn the entire economy around to benefit the Cubans as opposed to the Americans, which caused the Americans to then put embargoes on him. It causes Castro to turn towards the Soviet Union for help during the Cold War. And it all has its roots right here with big stick diplomacy, that we kind of force our way in to not only Cuban politics, but Cuban economics and agriculture to the point where we just kind of wear out our welcome. And that's kind of where it comes now. Why does that matter? We still have an embargo against Cuba. That's why you don't have anything made with Cuban sugar, which is decidedly better than the sugar that we are using currently. Um, I don't know if you guys have ever had what is known as Mexican Coke, which is Coca Cola that is bottled in Mexico. Some people will go to Kroger and specifically pick up those glass bottles of Coca Cola because they say, well, it just tastes better. It tastes better. They're not necessarily wrong. They're because Mexican Coke is made with Cuban sugar. It is sweeter. It's refined a little bit more. So therefore, there are a lot of people that really enjoy Cuban sugar. There are a lot of people that, of course, like Cuban cigars. That the tobacco that they grow down in Cuba is somehow better for the cigar. I'm not a cigar smoker myself, but there are some cigar aficionados who have told me that it's just not the same for some reason. It's just different. And when I was living over in Europe, my roommate would smoke Cuban cigars because they were legal over in Europe. They didn't have the embargo against Cuba, but they were illegal back in the United States. So the whole phrase "smoke 'em if you got 'em" type mentality happened when Tom tried to come back to the United States. He had to smoke all of his Cuban cigars before he came back to the U.S. because if he put them in his travel bags, if he put them into his carry-on or whatever else, he could get nailed at the border when he flew back into the United States for trying to bring an illegal substance back into the United States, an embargoed substance. Again, all that happened with Cuba in the 1950s and beyond, but the roots are here at the turn of the 1900s, turn of the 20th century. Now, this is followed up by Taft. William Howard Taft takes over after Roosevelt leaves office. Taft basically used American business loans to assure U.S. dominance of Latin America. This is not only saying we're going to get involved in, Latin American politics and economics. Now we're going to really finish the deal and make Latin America a very large banana republic. This mentality that they are going to grow and become more dominant. Now, this is, of course, the imperialist mentality, but there are some anti imperialists. There are some people that basically combat the jingoism that we were talking about. They combat the idea that, these presidents are going too far. They're basically saying that this is not what the American Republic was all about. This is not what our Declaration of Independence is all about. And I think keep in mind us basically making colonies out of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, you name it. Isn't that kind of what we fought against in the American Revolution? And that's what people like Mark Twain would be saying. That's what people like Andrew Carnegie, of all people, Carnegie would definitely benefit from, this imperialist mentality because his industry was steel, and steel would definitely be used to make military vehicles, to make arms and ammunition. It'd be used to build railroads in the places that we're going. Like he would definitely benefit from it, but he thought it was morally bankrupt to do this. So there were anti-imperialists. The problem is they were a very small number, and a lot of them were aged. Twain was not exactly a spring chicken. Carnegie was basically in the latter half of his life, and the imperialists were all younger people. You're talking about Teddy Roosevelt, who was in his 40s when he took over, Taft, who was also in his 40s and early 50s. You had people like Albert Beveridge, who was this young senator from Indiana who really kind of, talks about the importance of taking over these places and spreading American democracy and American industrialization and American efficiency. So these young imperialists tend to outmaneuver the anti imperialists, but there were people, like I said, who were preaching against this. Now, the effect of imperialism, it shows the emerging U.S. power and prestige. We are growing. We are becoming more relevant on the world stage. There are questions of the U.S. place in the world. Are we a superpower? We just beat Spain. Spain is, of course, on the decline, but where does that place us? Does that mean we're up with the English? Does that mean we're up with the Germans and the French? Does that mean we're better than China? Does that mean we're better than Japan? Where do we fit? And of course, this brings questions about jingoism as a foreign policy. Is this really a good idea to have an aggressive foreign policy? It doesn't help that you have yellow journalism of people like Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, where they are printing stories merely to raise readership rather than to raise actual factual reporting. And then, of course, when World War I starts, what do we do? Are we going to stay out of it? Is this a European struggle, or are we going to get involved because that's what imperialist nations do? Questions, of course, that will all be handled by the next president after Taft, a guy named Woodrow Wilson, who will be discussing not only in the progressive movement, but also Wilsonian politics, which will be the subject over the next couple of weeks. If you have any questions over this or anything else, or the Zoom call from last week, please reach out. Otherwise, have a great rest of the week. Have a strong end to the third quarter, and we'll talk to you soon.